Welcome to the Dutch Podcast, where integrative medicine providers and patients can learn about hormones and explore the body's most complex communication system. I'm your host, Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton, Chief Medical Officer for Dutch. Welcome to today's episode of the Dutch Podcast. I'm so excited because today I'm sitting with our owner and founder, Mark Newman, to talk all about some changes that we're putting forward on our report.
Getting the report to tell the story that's there and leveraging it for all that it tells you about the patient can be challenging. And that's been one of our number one challenges since day one, is folding education around the report to make sure that it's telling the story concisely and efficiently.
You'll see these changes live. They have gone live already. And really, this is the first in a series of changes that we'll be putting forward with the goal of helping make the report easier and faster to interpret. Well, welcome, Mark. We had the chance to see each other yesterday and then bright and early this morning. So it's good to see you in studio. We were together yesterday at 8:4
in your time zone. Yeah.
In my time zone. And then we took two different planes and then met up this morning to record this. So good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So this is exciting, this podcast, because we get the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been up to and what our customers are starting to see. We launched some changes to our report last week, and our doctor team got first look at about the first 500 tests that got out with this new report. And let me tell you, there was some real genuine excitement over what they were seeing and the additional value that it drove to the report. But before we get into those details, why don't you share a little bit with us about why we're modifying this report? I mean, the Dutch test has been around for 10 years. We have so many customers who love it. The company's been growing. We're able to help a lot of patients. And yet there's still more work to be done.
Yeah, I think, we want to always be real with the pros and cons of what we do, and the comprehensiveness of what we do, and the story that it can tell has always been like one of our number one values. And I think we do the things we do better than anyone. I think we focus solely on that, and I think there's been a payoff for that in terms of the quality of what we do. But one of the realities of what we do is that getting the report to tell the story that's there and leveraging it for all that it tells you about the patient can be challenging. And that's been one of our number one challenges since day one, is folding education around the report to make sure that it's telling the story concisely and efficiently, and just quite frankly, from lots and lots of good and also some constructive feedback over the years, we know that there's a series of changes that we need to make to the report. You mentioned people seeing what we've been up to, and they're getting to see a little bit of that here, but there's been an immense amount of work behind the scenes at retooling different parts of the report in different ways and getting feedback and trying to make sure that we find the most intuitive ways and efficient ways to lay out the sort of Dutch story with the report. And so we are beginning a process of thoughtfully improving that. And this is the first and a significant step in that direction. And I think it was great to hear from the team as they could see some of the nuances of a fairly subtle change that is making it easier to see certain realities, and for that message to sort of tell the story a little bit easier. So that's been good to see.
Yeah, it's great. And I love that we're walking down this road, as you know, because when I talk with providers about Dutch tests, which I get the chance to as a provider myself, it's sometimes surprising that even the people that I've mentored from or look up to still struggle with areas of interpretation for the Dutch test. And that's common. Like if you're a listener and you love the Dutch test, but you're also confused by parts of it, or you just skip over parts of it, that's a common experience. And that's okay. There's still a lot you can get out of it at different layers of the onion, let's say. But I think helping people get those insights out more easily is a huge win, because there's so much that you can learn about your patient and that you can apply. Since I've been here, and I used the Dutch test for, I think, probably 6 or 7 years before I joined the team. I was pretty early adopter being in women's health, but my experience and my application of the Dutch test has grown over the years, and even more so, kind of refining those concepts that I didn't quite get since I've been at Dutch. So it's really, really amazing to be tackling this.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a bridge that we try to get people over, and it's not a test of intelligence in the sense of like some really brilliant doctors that are just not that familiar with the different layers of what we do. Just need the time and exposure to some of the different patterns and the way to pick up different things, and a lot of that has to do with the education that we create that we fold around the test. But the report itself has we've been sort of collecting ideas and testing ideas for quite a while now at how to just present it in a way that just makes your sort of cognitive load lower when you're trying to just understand what in the world does this say about this particular patient so that you're moving in a positive direction for the patient with confidence.
Yeah. So this change that we just launched last week includes some just like design changes that are really to make it easier on the eye, create more space, help you navigate to the right places. And then we did add a new scientific concept this time as well. So why don't we start with just the design changes?
Yeah, I mean, the design change is just simply a transformation of what we've always called fan style gauges, which is just that sort of leaning meter of do you lean to the left or do you lean to the right? And in our case, it's a metabolic preference of, if I have a woman and she has androgens, does she push them down the 5 alpha pathway, which we know makes them more androgenic, or does she push them down the other pathway? And it's really just an aesthetic difference moving from one style to the other. But because we saved a little space, then we're able to add a little extra data, which is just a numeric value. So you can see the population percentile, which we use a lot in describing things in terms of how we present data. So 50th percentile, meaning you're exactly average. And as you go down to, the first percentile, meaning almost everyone's higher than you. And at the 99th percentile, holy cow, you've got like some really, a pattern that's really, really extreme. And so having, as you do like follow up testing, having a quantitative value with that can be helpful as you, because sometimes just nudging those gently, if I've got a 5 alpha preference and I nudge it gently with some nettles or saw palmetto or whatever, to be able to tell the patient, hey, look, we're moving something here, and that's going to be meaningful for you in terms of your symptoms. So that's the first step, is just changing that style to create a little more space, to put something quantitative with those that have been a little more qualitative in how they've been interpreted, and that was coordinated with then also the new information that we're putting on the test that wasn't there or wasn't presented in that way before. So
And what's the new information? Let's talk about that next.
um, estrogen metabolism is one of the biggest reasons people use our test, and so in our efforts to make it simple and easy, we use the pie chart, which is kind of a fun way to present that data, and it presents it as a three-way ratio. So in one picture, you get all three values: 2 hydroxy, which we know is more friendly on the cancer story; 4 hydroxy, which has more carcinogenic potential; and the 16 hydroxy, which is that more potent estrogenic metabolite. So, people use good, bad, and ugly as like terms for those. And so there's a lot of education wrapped around that. And so in our efficiency of doing that in one picture, there is a challenge, and that is, just as an example, when the 16 hydroxy is way out of whack, then that's really interesting. But then in that patient's case, the 2 hydroxy and the 4 hydroxy are still, in a biochemical way, are still competing for something that the 16 hydroxy is somewhat indifferent to. So then you still want to be able to ask yourself, okay, well, how are these two doing in terms of their tug of war? And when the 16 hydroxy becomes extreme, small, extremely big, then really, if you wanted to interpret it most appropriately, you'd have additional math to do where you need to look at the ratio of just those two. And so what that three-way ratio is essentially is two two-way ratios kind of layered on top of each other in a way that's more efficient, except when it's not. In these some cases, what doctors will be able to see as this comes out is now, instead of the pie chart, what we have, it will not, instead of, for now, in addition to, there's a 2 to 16 ratio, which is something people have been reporting for a long time, and the 2 to 4 ratio. So two-way ratios to look at the sort of tug of war between the 2 and the 16 and the 2 and the 4 in terms of just the metabolic preference. And so you get a little more precision in terms of understanding what's going on there. So just to give sort of a clinical spin on an example. If the 16 hydroxy is very interesting because it's so big or so small, and then you look further at the 2 and the 4 and you see, this is it's sort of hard to tease out on this one, but I still have a 4 hydroxy preference relative to the 2 that maybe was a little bit hard to pick up with the pie chart, then I might think, oh, maybe DIM is something I want to do. Maybe just supporting glutathione. I'm going to pay more attention to the methylation because that's how we get rid of 4 hydroxyestrogens is glutathione, methylation, resveratrol, these different things that upregulates quinone reductase. Like there's this whole story, right, that you can tell in an education sense. But the first job for us is to make sure that you're understanding properly the relationships that are meaningful. And this is going to help, I think, highlight that in a way that's easier to understand. And then when people get used to that, it's also, I think, going to be a little quicker mentally and a little bit easier of an intuitive story to tell to your patient.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I can just speak to the fact that as our doctor team reviewed reports, we saw examples of exactly that, where the 16 was so high. And, even they were saying, oh, I might not have picked up on that 2-4 ratio being off, but it's so clearly off with the slider bars. So
Right.
it really makes it so much easier to see. If we can, see if we can link an example of what we're talking about in the show notes, because we have some real time data that's come out of the lab already. And it might be interesting for you to have a look. That way you can take a look at exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And the other piece that I might add to that is that the ratios themselves are now in published literature in several studies, when we're looking at 2-4 and 2-16. So another kind of element of this that's beneficial is we can start to align more with what's come out in the last 10 years when it comes to publications around this
Right.
topic
Well,
specifically.
I and our own publication is working its way through peer review, and our creativity with the pie chart is like an interesting way to do that, but you can't throw that in a manuscript when the history of the reporting of that over the last few years especially has been to look at those ratios the way that we're now presenting it. And so that's a part of it is now there'll be an alignment with the literature that we ourselves are putting out. So we looked at a cohort of women that were on nothing and then on DIM. And the reason they took DIM is because their estrogen's a little bit out of whack. And it's just really fascinating to see as a class of people how those changes have occurred and some interesting and predictable things and also some surprising things coming out of that data. And then not to get too sneak peek-ish, but lined up behind that, we have another paper where we're looking at the same scenario, but with women on patches. So now back into the HRT side of things and with and without products that have diindolylmethane or indole 3 carbonyl that are meant to shove that estrogen or pull that estrogen down the 2 hydroxy pathway and just looking at, okay, in real life, like what changes do we actually see? And so those from the literature will then align better with what we're doing with the report, which makes a lot of sense in terms of just our long-term position and being able to have more holistic conversations about the literature all the way through to like real patients and what we're doing with them.
Yeah, very exciting. So, when it comes to the ratios, just to review for listeners, we will be showing the population percentile on the slider, just like we do for everything else. The actual ratios can be found on page 2 in the table, though. So, if you wanted to see the numeric value for the ratio, you can get that. It's just not on the infographic page. The infographic page shows population percentile, just like every other slider bar does. So, that's just important to keep in mind so that you know what you're looking at. Anything else
Right.
that you'd
And
add to that
I
conversation?
would just say one like easy point of confusion that is also easy to clear up is there are the pie chart that people are used to have percentages on them, and those are different types of percentages than the population percentile. So the population percentile just says where are you relative to your peers, 50 or lower, 50 or higher, whatever. And the pie chart that we've been using says this particular metabolite is what percentage of the total of the three. So if when you have on the same page percentages and they represent different things, like at first glance it might be a little bit confusing, but they're both pretty intuitive um, concepts. They're just different from each other, so that's maybe good for people to know heading into it.
Great. We do encourage you to start to take a look at the slider bars. I think you will, the first couple of tests, it might be a minute for you to take a look and reorient yourself. But I think you're very quickly going to find that they're so much easier and faster for you to interpret because it's just so much more clear where the dominant metabolite is 2, 4, and 16.
Yeah, and one more point I think I might point out is one question that people have is like do I care about the reference range or do I care just where I am? I think there's some philosophical conversations to have around that in the sense of, you can have a pretty so we set our reference ranges for that at the 20th and 80th percentile. So there's some green space in between, and that's in and out. But ultimately, reference ranges have a level of arbitrariness to them, and so there are multiple ways you can handle that. One, you can just ignore it unless it's out of range. But when we look at the literature, especially how multifactorial these are, like where are your estrogens? How's phase one? How is phase two? If you have, let's say, negative outcomes on multiple places, it doesn't have to be extreme necessarily and out of range in order for it to be noteworthy. So if you're in that, I would say 40 to 60 percentile, you would say there's very mild preference. But then when you get outside of that, you're still within the range, but it is a noteworthy preference when you get into that, say, 20 to 40 percentile where you're in the range, but it's a pretty decent lean metabolically in a particular direction. 4-hydroxy being an example. If you lean in the 4-hydroxy moderately and you lean away from good methylation moderately, that's probably worth people's attention in terms of at least some gentle support of the hypothetical negative outcomes that you might get from that particular thing. And then, of course, you want to overlay, the patient, picture on any one of those in terms of what's
Mhm.
actually going on with the patient.
And the
So,
absolute
yeah,
value of the estrogens, right? So if you had low
right,
estrogen with that pattern, it might not be as clinically meaningful as a patient with higher estrogen in that pattern, just because the
yeah,
total amount might be different. So there are those multiple layers. But again, we want you to be able to find each of those factors really quickly. And the point of this change is to help you get there faster and get more clarification around that estrogen metabolism section.
yeah, absolutely. And then, as I said, this is step one in a pretty long series of a couple rounds of, I think, things that are going to make it easier for the Dutch report to tell the story to people in a way that's intuitive. And so we're really excited to help people. We've heard your feedback on that this is a challenging test. We love it. But it has its challenges, and some of those are just like help us interpret it better, which is why we have such a fantastic clinical team and education, which helps immensely. But we want to take some steps with the report itself, and this is step one. And I think people are going to appreciate the change.
I think so too. Wonderful. We are so glad you joined us today for this in-depth conversation. If you want to learn how Dutch testing can help you profoundly change your patients' lives, visit us at dutchtest.com/providers. There, you can become a provider and gain access to exclusive hormone education, like our Dutch interpretive guide and the Mastering Functional Hormones testing course, a self-paced online course designed to help you become a hormone expert. If you enjoy listening to the Dutch podcast, please help us spread the word by commenting and sharing the show on your favorite streaming app. Also, stay connected with us by following at Dutch Test on Instagram and Facebook, where you'll find even more news, education, and provider resources. Thank you so much for joining us today. Come back next week for more.